Hey folks, welcome back to the Engineered Angler. I'm Franco. I'm a professional engineer and an avid lure designer and fisherman. And today we're not going to make a lure. Today we're going to talk about some subscriber questions that have been coming in and are pretty interesting questions and a little difficult to answer just sort of in written form. So I thought it would be easier to do it in a quick video. So here are the topics I'm going to try to hit on. Using micro balloons, resin by weight, in other words mixing your casting resin by weight. Some questions about lures and other items that are being designed for patent. What kind of UV light do I use? Methods to tune your lure, and try to resolve what the volume of the lure is if you've already got the lure made and you need to know. So if any of this stuff is interesting to you guys, stick around. We'll try to make it as interesting as possible. Before I get too far into these questions, I just want to mention one thing, and that is that if you guys are commenting on the channel and the comments tend to be political or religious or sexual or anything that obviously is just inappropriate for a channel like this, your comment will be deleted. If it's like really nasty or just in bad taste, or just meant to be mean and nasty, then the comment will probably get deleted and you won't have access to comment. So sorry, but this channel really is just to explore ideas about lures and methods to make things, any kind of fabrication. And if that's what you're into, certainly comment, ask questions. And if you want to criticize me, you can absolutely criticize me. Just there's no need for nastiness. All right, let's get to the questions. Okay, using micro balloons. Now, if you don't know what micro balloons are, let me show you. Here's an entire gallon. It's a very fine powder, and it is essentially glass turned into microspheres. Just tiny little balloons of glass. It's pretty much inert, but it's not a good idea to breathe it either. So I bought this gallon a while back, and I got it from a company called Raw Materials in California. It's kind of a big bulk to buy, but you can go through quite a bit of it if you're making a lot of lures. And you use this to lower the density of the resin that you're making your lure out of. And the idea is to make your lure more floaty, more buoyant. I measured the density, and I've written down the density as 0.14 grams per milliliter. So I'm assuming my calculations were correct on this. So I've had questions about using this to create resin mixes that are buoyant. And the reality is, if you're using a fast set resin, a resin that sets up in 10 to 15 to 20 minutes, the expansion rate on that is high enough that typically the actual resin without microspheres is buoyant. In other words, it would float without the stuff in there. But usually not enough to sort of float the hardware that you're going to put on your lure. So you usually have to use this. Typically I use what I call a 10% mix, and if you haven't seen that video, I'll put a link up here for it, and I show you what my 10% mix is. And that mix, it should be all you ever need, unless you want to make it heavier. In other words, you want to use fewer microballoons or less microballoons. And just remember, when I use this, I use it by weight, not by volume. And so when you do that, it's actually pretty shocking how much you actually put in. Going much beyond the 10% mix tends to make the resin softer, actually surface-wise, and otherwise your fingernail will penetrate in it much more easily. It doesn't lose all its strength, but it certainly is weaker. And so if you're not using an internal harness, an internal wire harness, then putting much more than 10% of the microballoons may not be a great idea. Typically on a lure especially a crankbait that isn't running straight or won't tune correctly, that's typically a geometric issue, an issue with the shape of the lure, the position of your dive lip, symmetry, that kind of thing, and very often the position of the tie-on eye is really critical. So play around with those things before you try to get too crazy with making it super buoyant and putting a lot of belly weight in it. really doesn't do it. If you've got a lure that has a dive lip on it, trying to correct swimming issues with more weight or less weight, it's usually not effective because the dive lip has such a high degree of influence on the way the lure moves, because it's just hydrodynamically, it just overwhelms everything else about the lure. It's not likely you're going to be able to correct anything with just adding weight. The other question I've gotten, if my resin, usually a clear coat, has instructions that tell me that I need to mix by volume, and the two different components have different specific gravities, what do I do if I want to mix by weight? Because I always tell everybody, mix by weight, it's the best way to be super accurate. All right, if you get your part A and part B of your clear coat and go to the manufacturer or look at the paperwork that comes with it and look up the specific gravity. It's usually annotated as an SG. And typically it'll be somewhere around 1.1, maybe 1.2. And let's just say B is 1.02. So all you really need to do is just divide A over B, and what you end up with is a factor, which in this case is 1.1, which means that for every gram of A, you're going to need 1.1 gram of B. And then from then on, you can either make your table of different weights, or you can just decide that every time you mix 2 grams of A, you're going to mix 2.2 grams of B. And that'll give you the right ratio to get a good hard set on your clear coat. Hope that makes sense. So the other question I've had, and I've had this over the years several times, is folks have asked me to help develop products that they wish to patent. And that's cool. I don't mind answering general questions. But if you have something like that, don't send me your idea. I don't want to have that liability to know what your idea is, because later on if I come up with something that's similar, and I am an inventor myself, so if I come up with something similar, I don't want to be accused of stealing anybody's ideas. So if you have a question and it's something that you are considering marketing, then certainly ask a general question about whatever process or whatever design issue you might have, and I'll do my best to help, but don't share your actual idea. Alright, so if you've been watching the channel for a while, you know I use ultraviolet resin to use as clear coats. And this is my UV curing chamber. It is a turning wheel to turn my lures, and it has UV lamps in it that help cure it, or actually cures it. And I get a lot of folks ask me what kind of lamps they are. They're 9-watt fluorescent style bulbs that are 395 nanometers wavelength of ultraviolet, and I find that wavelength to be really productive. It tends to set pretty quickly without over catalyzing the resin and getting it too hot so it cracks or becomes too brittle. There are 8 bulbs in there, and so that's a total of 72 watts of power, which isn't enormous, but it's pretty good. It means that I can set multiple lures and still get a good set time, around an hour, for a really complete set. I know you've seen on YouTube folks setting UV resin in just seconds, 20 seconds and it's set, and they throw it on the ground and all that. The reality is when you do this, it'll set in 20 seconds. It won't smear and it won't be soft to the touch, but you'll note that it isn't completely set. You can smell it, and you'll notice that it has a sort of haze to it. So my recommendation is most will need about 30 minutes to fully set. I also have this small spotlight, and it's an LED spotlight. It's only 10 watts, but since I can get the item close to the glass, it will set a droplet or a small hole that I've filled, any small portion of the resin. It'll set it up in just seconds. So I get a lot of questions about what essentially ends up being lure tuning, because folks, or lure designers, are actually getting frustrated with lures, swim baits, crankbaits, glide baits that aren't retrieving smooth and straight and without flopping or rolling or scrolling on them. And that needs to be addressed with tuning techniques first, before you go into sort of digging into your actual design, weight and balance, and the shape of the lure. Of course, this is assuming that you've made a lure that is symmetric or pretty close to symmetric, and that you've placed your dive bib, if it has one, square to the lure without any kind of twist in it. So here's a crankbait that I made a few videos ago, and it's designed to be a weight shift. And I did have to kind of struggle a little bit to get this thing to tune correctly. And even though it's perfectly symmetric, because I made it on the lathe, it did have its issues, mostly because of the weight shift. So most people know that if you're cranking in a crankbait and it's tending to go to one side or the other, and you correct by bending the tie-on eye very slightly to the opposite direction of the movement. If you're having an issue with roll, where it won't crank at all, you may have an issue where the tie-on eye is too high or too low on the lure. Believe it or not, it can make a huge difference depending on how susceptible your lure shape is to that particular adjustment. This particular lure is very sensitive to that, and I believe it's because of the flat, straight back. So if you have, let's say this is the head of your crankbait, what I recommend is that instead of having your tie-on eye hard up against the body like that, do an experimental model where you have an extra millimeter sticking out. That will give you some leeway on adjusting this tie-on eye, not only laterally, left and right, but up and down. And if you take a close look at this one, you can see how I've kind of manhandled this one. You can see it's a little bit torqued. So the point where it's pulling from is manipulated just slightly. And I think you're going to see that there's a difference in the performance of the lure. Sometimes it'll fix your roll problem, and then you'll have to modify your design from there, because that means there's an issue with balance. So the last of the questions, or at least the topics, is how to get the volume of a lure that you already own. Maybe you bought it at Walmart or Bass Pro. And the technique is really simple. Getting really accurate results is a little bit involved, but it can be done, and all you gotta do it is once, and then you actually have that volume. And if you replicate, let's not say copy, if you replicate that lure, then you'll have that volume for both casting it and creating the mold itself, and adding weight and getting the actual balance of that lure right. But let me show you. You got to use a small container that will hold enough water that you're going to displace. This is just a piece of PVC glued to a board with a small piece of tube glued into a hole there. So it's simple enough. You just want to fill the little volume tank here until it overflows, and then I'll let it drip until it stops dripping into this cup. And when the dripping has stopped, just take the water out of that cup, put it on a small gram scale. Now you can also put a very sort of accurate milliliter measuring cup here and measure a direct volume. But this works really good for me because I'm doing this over and over. So I'm zeroing it with the cup on there, and then I'll submerge my lure in there. And I make sure that I don't get too much of my lure holder in the water. And then you just hold it in there until the dripping stops. And at that point, you have a gram weight. This one is 30.25 grams. That means it's 30.25 milliliters of water. That means the lure is 30.25 milliliters. That's the volume of the lure. Now I will say that it's not a good idea to just do this one time. You want to do 3 to 5 times, repeat it 3 to 5 times, and then average them, because you're going to find that there's going to be some difference, because tiny air bubbles will stick in different locations on the lure. I also put a tiny drop of a little bit of dishwashing detergent in the water just to break that surface tension and make the dripping stop more quickly. Alright, well, I hope that wasn't too boring, and I hope you guys got something out of that. Here's a little video that I posted on Facebook of a lure that I'm playing around with some UV reflective paints. Take a look at how it sort of shifts and transforms as the UV light hits it. I'll see you in the next video.